Something in the air felt different. The windows were slightly open, but no breeze came in. The bells of St. Peter's Square rang earlier than usual, and inside a quiet room, the most beloved man of the faith made one last request. He didn't ask for gold. He didn't ask for speeches. He didn't ask for crowds. He didn't ask for words of comfort. He only asked for a reunion, a simple gesture with a being who doesn't speak, a four-legged friend who had always understood him in silence. And it was in that moment, seconds away from the final farewell, that something happened, something that would touch the hearts of those who witnessed it. And now, you're about to hear it. If stories like this touch your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us continue sharing moments that speak to the soul. Thank you for being here. On that morning in Rome, the sky was dull, the clouds not foretelling a storm, but the entire Vatican knew something profound was about to happen. There was no commotion, no rush, only the sound of the bells ringing a little slower, as if asking for silence. Inside one of the most guarded rooms, lying under white sheets with his hands clasped, rested the man who had guided millions with his voice, but now preferred silence. The Holy Father no longer spoke much. His eyes remained closed, not from absence, but from contemplation. Around him, doctors, aides, and clergy observed with reverence. Every small gesture carried the weight of eternity. Then, between one prayer and another, he slowly opened his eyes. He looked at a nearby sister and said in a broken, sacred voice, "Bring me Baltazar." The sister froze for a second. The others exchanged confused glances. Baltazar? Was it a cardinal, a priest, a visitor? But the Pope's gaze was clear. There was no doubt. Baltazar was a dog, a faithful four-legged companion who had been by his side for years. A white, medium-sized dog with gentle eyes and an immense heart. Baltazar hadn't lived in the Vatican since the Holy Father began to fall ill. The dog had been taken to Castel Gandolfo under the care of an elderly sister, Sister Domenica, who fed him, petted him, and spoke to him in soft, prayer-like words. But the dog was never the same again. He didn't play, barely ate, slept beside an old cassock, and sometimes howled softly, as if mourning an absence he couldn't name. To understand this simple yet profound request, we must go back, way back, long before the Vatican, long before the crowds, long before the white robes. We must go back to Argentina, when Jorge Mario was just a rosy-cheeked boy with curious eyes running through the streets of Buenos Aires. The son of humble, deeply religious parents, Jorge grew up hearing a phrase he would never forget. Jorge, every living being carries the breath of God. With this teaching, he learned to respect ants, birds, cats, and especially dogs. He loved street dogs, shared his lunch with them, sat on the sidewalk, and petted the ones afraid of adults. His mother once said that he came home with dirty knees and a trembling puppy in his arms. "I couldn't leave him alone, Mama." As an adult in the seminary, Jorge was known for always feeding the dogs that roamed the convent. Even as an archbishop, he never denied an act of kindness to an abandoned animal. Faith and tenderness always walked together in his soul. So when he became pope and took the name Francis, like the saint who loved all creatures, no one was surprised. And no one was surprised when, one day, a light-furred dog appeared in the Vatican gardens and, inexplicably, lay at the Pope's feet, as if he already knew him. Francis simply smiled, knelt with effort, and whispered, "Baltazar." Back to the present. The search for Baltazar became urgent. A car was immediately sent to Castel Gandolfo. Inside, Sister Domenica held the dog in her arms, stroking his head tenderly. "He knows, my son. He knows," she murmured to the driver. Baltazar, who hadn't eaten in days, now trembled, but not from fear. His eyes were fixed on the road, as if he knew where he was going. Time seemed to be working against them. In the Pope's room, his vitals were stable but fragile. His breathing was soft, almost like a whispered prayer. When the car arrived, Baltazar stepped out without hesitation. He didn't bark. He didn't pull on the leash. He simply walked, as if each step was guided by something greater. The Vatican corridors seemed to recognize his pause. Guards made way. Sisters bowed their heads. And then, before the bedroom door, Baltazar stopped. No one knew what he would do. No one knew if there was still time. But in that moment, as the door slowly opened, everyone understood something. This reunion wasn't just between a man and his dog. It was between two souls who had walked side by side, who may have been created for this very purpose. Baltazar walked as if he understood. His steps were calm, but firm. There was no restlessness, no fear. The Vatican corridors seemed to recognize the sound of his pause. It was as if time had slowed, more solemn, more sacred. A dog walking among the Swiss guards with such dignity that for a moment it seemed he too wore an invisible cassock. When he reached the door, he stopped, not out of fear, but as if asking for permission, as if he understood that something sacred was happening inside. Sister Domenica's hands trembled as she touched the doorknob. She glanced at a guard who gave a slight nod. Then the door opened. Inside, everything was silent. Light filtered through white curtains. The Pope lay with his eyes closed, his head slightly tilted, his fingers resting on his chest. His face exuded peace. Baltazar didn't bark. He didn't run. He simply entered. The eyes of those present fixed on the animal. For a moment it was as if they had forgotten this was a dog. There was something greater there, something ancient, something spiritual. Baltazar approached the bed, stopped beside it, looked at the Pope's face, and sat down. He stayed still, ears slightly drooped, eyes fixed on the man he loved so much, as if waiting for a sign, a word, a sigh. But nothing happened. A nurse discreetly wiped a tear. A cardinal stepped back, unable to contain his emotion. Everything was so simple, yet so profound. Minutes passed, and Baltazar didn't move. He was like a sentinel, a guardian of love. Slowly, the Pope moved his fingers, a barely perceptible gesture, as if reaching for something just out of reach. But his eyes didn't open. Baltazar noticed. He leaned in, lay down beside the bed, and rested his snout on the sheet, close to the Pope's hand. There was no physical contact yet, but the gesture was enough, as if, in the invisible world of pure feelings, an embrace had already happened. Sister Domenica stepped away. She knew this wasn't a moment to witness. It was a moment to feel from a distance. Outside, the sun began to set behind the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The sky turned golden-orange, while Rome, indifferent to this intimate moment, continued its hurried rhythm. But inside, time had stopped. Baltazar closed his eyes. The Pope breathed softly, almost imperceptibly. No sound, no words, just the sound of time itself breathing. Then, something almost imperceptible happened. The Pope opened his eyes, just for a brief moment. He didn't speak, but his lips moved, and no one there knew for sure what he whispered. Baltazar lifted his head, looked at the Pope's face, and leaned in slightly, approaching with care, as if the fragility of the moment could shatter with any sudden movement. But there was no kiss, no touch, not yet, just closeness, presence, absolute respect. In the next room, the Pope's personal secretary received messages from around the world. Embassies, religious leaders, politicians, the faithful, all asking about the pontiff's condition. But no one knew what was happening in that exact moment. A dog, a room, and a man between earth and heaven. Meanwhile, a memory kept returning to Baltazar's mind. If dogs truly remember like we do, perhaps they remember with their bodies, with their noses, with their souls. He remembered Francis's hurried steps in the garden, the quiet voice, full of pauses. the calloused hands that knew how to bless and caress with the same tenderness. He remembered the afternoons they spent sitting together under an olive tree, where the Pope would simply watch him, as if thanking God for the beauty of simplicity. And now he was here, steadfast, loyal, present. Time passed. The lights in the room were dimmed. Baltazar didn't move for hours. He stayed like a four-legged sentinel, like a white-furred angel. And so, that night, people began to realize something was happening. The Pope no longer responded to calls. His soul was slowly withdrawing. In the Vatican courtyard, footsteps echoed hollowly. A light breeze made the bells sway, and some faithful, without knowing why, began lighting candles before the image of St. Francis. There was a solemn calm in the air. Inside the room, Baltazar finally lay down beside the bed. There had been no goodbye yet, but the silence was growing heavier with meaning. And so, night fell. Francis, lying still. Baltazar, awake. The world, suspended. And you? What do you think about Pope Francis's closeness to animals? Do you believe he set a good example for humanity? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. The Vatican didn't sleep that night. The lights remained on, but softly, like invisible candles scattered through the halls. There were careful footsteps, hushed whispers, prayers with closed eyes and open hearts. It was as if everyone knew, without being told, that an era was ending. In the Pope's room, the atmosphere was one of reverence. Baltazar never left the bedside. He had chosen a spot on the left side where his body touched the cold marble floor, but his snout rested on the white sheet. He breathed calmly, as if listening to the rhythm of the heart of the man who had named him and welcomed him. The Pope didn't speak. His eyes remained closed. Sometimes a slight twitch of his fingers. Sometimes a sigh heavy with memories. But it was as if he were already navigating between two worlds, suspended between now and eternity. He was no longer just a man. He was a presence, a living story reaching its final point before becoming eternal memory. Hours earlier, a letter had arrived at the Vatican from the Franciscan community of Assisi. A brief, handwritten message. If Francis leaves us tonight, we know he will be among the birds, the dogs, the trees, and all those he knew how to love with eyes of tenderness. He will be remembered not just as one who spoke of God, but as one who saw him in every creature. The letter was read aloud softly by an aide, and strangely, Baltazar lifted his head at the end. He stayed still, as if he understood, as if he had been waiting for those words. In the next room, two nuns prepared an arrangement of olive branches and white flowers. The choice wasn't aesthetic, it was symbolic. The olive branch meant peace, and also the promise of life after the flood. The faith that there would always be a new beginning. But for the dog, there were no symbols, just the absence of sound, and the presence of something invisible, something he seemed to feel with every fiber of his being. Outside, the night sky began to break into shades of blue. It was still dawn, but the first shy rays of sunlight gently pushed back the darkness, as if the world was preparing, with reverence, for what was to come. Baltazar remained lying down. Once he slowly stood, circled the bed, and sniffed the Pope's pillow. Then he returned to his place, without a sound, without a bark. He was the guardian. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, where it all began, an elderly woman lit a candle before an image of St. Francis. She didn't know why, but she felt something in her chest. "He's leaving," she said simply. And a tear fell slowly. In the room, someone entered, a young priest recently arrived from Latin America who had met the Pope personally months before. He approached slowly, knelt in a corner, and prayed in silence. Baltazar turned his head toward him and watched for long seconds. Then he looked back at the bed. The priest would later write, "I've never seen a dog look with such depth." It was as if he already knew what no one could say, And yet he stayed there, in silence, waiting. The night wore on. Outside, the faithful began gathering in prayer. A spontaneous chain of faith formed, little by little. Lit candles, rosaries between fingers. Words murmured against the wind. There had been no official announcement, but love gives warning first. Inside the room, the Pope's breathing was light, rhythmic. His eyes didn't open again, but he still seemed to listen. He seemed present, even if distant. Baltazar stood once more. He took 2 steps forward and rested his snout on the Pope's right hand, which lay on his chest. He stayed there, perfectly still. Time seemed to freeze in that gesture. An aide stifled a sob, but no one dared to move in that moment. The silence said more than any prayer could. It was a silence filled with tears that didn't fall, but burned in the chest. Baltazar lay down one last time, now closer, his body pressed against the sheet. He closed his eyes and didn't move again. Outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the top of St. Peter's dome. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle, and Rome seemed to pause for a few seconds, unaware that in that exact moment, something sacred was about to happen. But that part of the story wouldn't be told just yet. The story of the farewell between a man and his dog, between Francis and Baltazar, didn't happen like in the movies. It was more real, more silent, more indescribable. The sun rises. The bells began to ring, not an alarm, not a hurried call, but a serene, continuous tolling, like a prayer cast in bronze. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica announced that time had changed. The Pope's room was calm. Light entered softly through the open curtains, illuminating the white sheets and the serene face of Francis. He had passed in peace. There was no struggle, no dramatic last breath, just a slight loosening of his fingers, a deep silence, and the certainty that in that moment a soul had returned home. But he didn't go alone. Baltazar was there, lying beside the bed, his snout still touching the fabric. And only when the bells began to ring did he stand. No one called him. No one taught him what to do. But the dog took 2 steps to the center of the room, looked around, and then lay down, his body facing the window, as if to say to the world, "I'll stay here until he is at peace." After the Pope's body was prepared, dressed simply, as he had always wanted, with a small wooden rosary in his hand, a gift from an African girl during an audience at the Vatican. Meanwhile, Baltazar was taken to an inner garden, but he didn't fuss. He didn't whine. He sat, looking at the sky. His chest rose and fell slowly, and when someone tried to call him, he simply looked back, then turned his eyes upward again. The world soon learned. News spread like wind. Pope Francis passes away this morning in the Vatican. Crowds began to form. People wept, prayed, sang. Some brought flowers, others brought only silence. But there was a deep, different emotion, something spiritual, inexplicable, as if the world had lost a father or a friend. The news traveled the world like a silent wave of grief. Pope Francis has died this morning. But it wasn't just news, it was an absence. That night, St. Peter's Square began to fill, even without an official announcement. The faithful came from all over, as if guided by an inner calling no one could explain. Candles were lit, photos placed, letters left behind, and among all the images, one began to appear spontaneously. St. Francis of Assisi, surrounded by animals. As if the people were saying, "He is gone, but he left us the love for all creation." Cameras focused on hands holding rosaries, tearful eyes, slow and respectful gestures. There was no chaos, no despair, just silence. And in that silence, Baltazar, the loyal dog who had spent the last hours by the Pope's side, remained quiet in one of the inner gardens. He didn't eat. He didn't play. He just looked at the sky, as if waiting for a sign. Some visitors reported seeing him walk to the Vatican's iron gates, stop before the crowd and lie down, head bowed, eyes fixed on the basilica. Without a word, people stepped back, making space, and the world seemed to understand. There was no coffin on the altar, but there was a gesture of love, of respect, of loyalty. In Buenos Aires, in the neighborhood where Jorge Mario Bergoglio grew up, an old woman placed flowers on the sidewalk where he used to play as a child. "He always loved dogs," she murmured, "and now one of them stays behind to speak for us." The legacy newspapers, live broadcasts, social media, images of Baltazar spread as a symbol of a love that transcends words. Baltazar, the friend who stayed until the end, the most moving silence in history, the last gesture of a pope who believed in love without limits. In Manila, Lisbon, Bogota, Rome, Maputo, Santiago, Quebec, people lit candles with Francis' picture and animals. Others held their own pets a little tighter. That night, the world wasn't just saying goodbye to a pope. It was saying goodbye to a soul who taught, through gestures and words, that to love is to look upon even the smallest with reverence. That dawn, something curious happened. A white dove, from no one knew where, landed on the windowsill of the room where Baltazar slept. The dog, lying down, slowly lifted his head. He looked at the bird, then at the sky. They stayed like that for a while, motionless, silent. And a nun watching from afar said softly, "I think he understood. I think he knew." The next morning, the photo of the dove and the dog circled the globe, and a phrase began to spread in many languages. Francis's last blessing came in silence and on 4 paws. Today, Baltazar lives retired in a convent in the Italian countryside. The sisters say he is calm but very sweet, that he sleeps beside an old cassock and sometimes gets up at dawn just to look at the sky, perhaps waiting for the sound of a voice, perhaps recognizing the presence of the one who never left him. Pope Francis left many lessons for humanity. He spoke of compassion, justice, humility. He taught about faith, forgiveness, hope. But one of the most beautiful was this: the love for animals, the respect for every living being, the understanding that every creature carries the breath of God, and that animals, even without words, love with more purity than many human hearts. That is sacred. Francis showed that no creature is too small to deserve love, and that a dog can be more loyal than 1,000 speeches, truer than 1,000 sermons. He taught us, not just with words, but with his heart. If this story moved you, take a deep breath and remember, animals are part of divine creation. They feel, they suffer, they love, and sometimes they reach God before we do. Do you believe animals are blessed creatures? That they have souls, feelings, and the capacity for unconditional love? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. Let's share this message everywhere. Leave a like if this story touched your heart. And if you're not subscribed yet, a big hug. Thank you for being here.